I just want to leave that with folks because this change that we're making, it's not comfortable initially for many of us, but we know it's necessary. And it will feel funny. We'll feel uncomfortable to change our ways, but we got to do something different to get a different outcome. Mm-hmm. And the opportunity's there. And we need to just reflect on that and take action.
Very true.
Free to Grow in Forestry, a podcast working to move forestry forward. The Canadian Institute of Forestry and the Centre for Social Intelligence proudly present the Free to Grow in Forestry podcast. The Free to Grow in Forestry initiative was launched to create a diverse and inclusive workplace culture where all Canadians feel they belong. We believe strongly that inclusive cultures not only strengthen our Canadian forest sector economy, but also create resilient and healthy communities. This podcast seeks out guests from all aspects of the forest sector, from the C-suite to every part of the underrepresented communities, to open up the dialogue on issues of concern and points of view so that everyone has greater knowledge and understanding of each other. By unearthing these discussions, we hope to stimulate greater empathy and respect for all people, opening up the forest sector to be more welcoming and accepting of everyone. For our 7th episode, we are pleased to be joined by our host, Kelly Cooper, founder and CEO of the Centre for Social Intelligence, and our guest, Trudy Samuel, Senior Director for Natural Resources Canada's Office for Equity, Diversity and Inclusion. Trudy shares her perspective on how the federal government has been taking action on diversity and inclusion, bringing clarity to possible perceptions and examples on how we can all work to do better. This session was recorded live on November 16th, 2021.
Well, good morning, everyone, and Free to Grow listeners. My name is Kelly Cooper. I am the co-lead of the Free to Grow in Forestry initiative and the president and CEO of the Centre for Social Intelligence. Today, I am very pleased to be speaking with Trudy Samuel, who is the executive lead for Equity, Diversity and Inclusion at Natural Resources Canada. Trudy and I have spent the better part of 30 years knowing each other through professional and personal opportunities that have cropped up over time in the natural resource space regarding oil and gas pipelines and the forest sector. And Trudy, it is a real pleasure to have you here with me today. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Kelly, what a treat to be with you today. Thank you for having me.
Trudy, because not everyone knows you like I do, I would like it to start with just telling us a little bit about yourself, both personally and professionally, and why you chose to take on this really important new role at NRCan.
Well, I'm an Ottawa Valley girl, born and raised in the Valley. So lumber is something that has always been a part of my life and where I live. I live on the banks of the Ottawa River on the Kitchissippi, and I'm sure I'm grateful to be in Algonquin traditional territory, really because people have been looking after this land and making a living from this land for a long time. And part of that is because those folks have been looking after it. So growing up, I'm surrounded by farming and natural resources in all of their forms. I certainly always had an appreciation for nature and for what nature could yield. And I was really fortunate to be right here in the Valley where we can do anything in terms of sports. I was always a paddler, a hiker, a backpacker, and have a snowshoer, skier, whatever. If it was outside, I was doing it. So what I'm doing in this desk job is crazy. So yeah, and I really believe in Canada, and I'm really proud to be a public servant. And so being of service to Canadians and to Canada is really important to me. I'm the one who was watching that Remembrance Day ceremony at the cenotaph with the tear rolling down because I'm proud of our nation. Lots of people have worked hard to defend Canada and to make it the country it is. And I've lived overseas just like you, Cal, and I know home sweet home. So why did I take this job? Oh, gosh. I think I was a bit nuts to take it. I took the job because of the challenge that marries a few passions of mine. It marries the notion that we can do things sustainably. And that means doing things sustainably for the planet. It means doing things sustainably for people. And as well, it means doing things in a way that ensures everyone is able to move forward in a good way. I knew that we had some challenges around how do we take a workplace where people don't really have a lot of awareness of the impacts that we have on one another from an interpersonal as well, professional and personal perspective. How can we take that and transform it into an organization where people feel included, where we're reflective of the population of Canada, and where our programs and policies, rather than creating barriers and excluding people on an ongoing basis, actually open the doors to innovation and the opportunities that are out there by welcoming people in. I also thought people think, I better say, I'm a Black woman, a proud African Canadian. That means my ancestors came to this country to be free. And so that means that they eked out a living from the land and worked in partnership with Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people to really create a life for us. My relatives have been organizers, people who were very involved in church and community, and have a thirst for justice, a passion for service, and a faith that makes them just not quit. So that's why I took that job, Kel. I hope that sums it up for you well.
Yeah, that's excellent. And appreciate both angles, the personal and professional take on that. So the whole purpose of our chat today was to educate people on what's happening right now in the federal government on diversity and inclusion. And so I'd like to explore that. And then I want to drill into specifically what's happening, of course, in the forest sector. So can you give us a sense of what the government of Canada is currently doing on D&I? Because there's a lot of perception that there are a lot of women already in senior positions. There's a lot of good hiring practices in place with 3-person panels. So there's a bit of confusion that there's even an issue at all in the federal government. So if you could cast a wide net for us to start and position us on where things are at with the federal government on this issue, that would be a great start for our conversation.
Happy to. First, I want to give a good old government caveat. I'm going to give Trudy's take. I'm going to give you an understanding of where I come from and how I see the world. I'm not speaking for anyone else but myself and bringing my take to the table. I'm a practitioner, and this whole approach to equity, diversity, and inclusion, as I've heard, it's a learning thing. It's not a game that has clear rules and or a set formula. And to pretend that it is would be a bit naive of me. So I'm going to give you that. In the government of Canada, what I see is that we are hearing from our industry partners. We're hearing from Canadians. We're hearing from people we collaborate with from non-government organizations. And we know ourselves that we need to make a change. So I think it was in January 2021, the clerk, who's the most senior civil servant, issued a call to action on anti-racism, equity, and inclusion. So we take our orders from the clerk of the Privy Council, who said to all of his deputy ministers, go forth, increase representation, particularly of Blacks, Indigenous peoples, and persons with disabilities. He said, make sure that you're creating organizations that have a culture of inclusion, where people feel they belong, where they have access and influence and can get to the table. The clerk's call to action asks us to have a good look at our programs and policies so that we are being sure not to create barriers and are actually harnessing the opportunity, the potential for innovation, whether it's renewal of our workforces or supporting industry, supporting not-for-profits, supporting other public institutions in moving towards better representation and improved access and influence and opportunities for people. So if we're going to really do this, the government of Canada has mobilized all kinds of people to start doing it. You know, it's funny you said it seems like we have great representation and we have moved it forward. And, we have. Like when my mom was hired as a civil servant, somebody said to her, she said these 3 little brown kids' pictures on her desk. And somebody said to her, whoa, what, you got Black kids? And she said, yeah, I'm fair skinned, but my kids are darker skinned than I am. Her boss said to her, well, if I'd known you were Black, I wouldn't have hired you. And today, we're in a situation where people like me and you and others, we're all finding our place. But there's still barriers, Kel. I wish I could say there weren't. We've studied it, and we know that there are folks who are facing, like, for example, in our employment, in our recruitment processes, we've seen now that there are systematic drop-offs for persons with disabilities, for Indigenous peoples, for persons coming from racialized communities. We know now, the Public Service Commission has looked at it, so we know we have that. We also know that we work with NRCan to identify where should we be to be representative. And we've got some serious gaps, particularly for persons with disabilities, particularly for Blacks, particularly in specific areas. For example, in research, are we where we want to be with women? So we still have work to do. And the fact that there are still those gaps tells us that, hey, we can do better in terms of really understanding and engaging our client base, the people we want to serve better. So across the government, we're seeing every department or many departments are mobilizing to do that. And the way they're doing it all different ways. And, I've been looking at industry, and honestly, I think industry is ahead in doing this because of that potential to me, which was about, I think I heard someone say, it's not a nice thing to do anymore. It's actually good for business. So I think
I heard that.
I don't know. I think it was on a Free to Grow podcast. But it's true. I've heard it numerous times in numerous places and looked at the data as well in terms of the yield. It's difficult initially to get to the kind of diversity and inclusion we want, but it can create some returns that industry is showing are actually quite solid. So,
well, the other piece of that I like to talk about, not just the business case that's there for a return on the investment of doing something, but it's also the cost of inaction that people do not factor into the costs associated with D&I. And so people always go, well, what do you mean? And I say, well, it's clear to me that if you had prevention plans in place for codes of conduct, for example, and I speak specifically in the forest sector now, with the sexual harassment cases that are coming out, well, if you actually had a better code of conduct and practices in place, you would not be sued for large amounts through the court system for sexual harassment. And people don't seem to connect those dots very much, but it's really an important part of what I talk about with the value proposition for D&I.
Absolutely. And, Kelly, those mechanisms for resolution, for reconciliation that can preempt conflict at a more serious level, we're very aware of. And, I've had some great experiences working with Indigenous communities, with all kinds of communities, actually, with all kinds of cultural and socioeconomic profiles. And so it is also this notion that if we can prevent conflict, it's actually good for everybody. And even better, what I'm seeing, and for example, in the forest sector, is we can work together, not just for prevention, but to optimize the collaboration and create the context for growth for everyone. And that's for innovation and that's the sweet spot. Mm-hmm. The other benefits that I see to building those kinds of relationships that are predicated on the notion that I'm not going to dominate just because I come from the background I come from, or that I have more money or the power leans my direction. It actually lends itself to better sharing of information and intelligence that prevents people from getting into the kinds of push and pull. I love looking at it as it's not a zero-sum game anymore. We can't characterize those on the other side of the table as a polarization. It's not binary. The world has evolved, and frankly, people aren't standing down.
So that's excellent. So you talked about January 21 being the sort of pivotal timeline in the government of Canada where all departments were directed to make an action plan of sorts. Can you speak to what NRCan is doing and in general, I guess, on D&I? Obviously, creating your position is a new position, which is exciting. I think it's excellent. And I believe you report directly to the DMO, the Deputy Minister's Office, also perfect. That's what I speak about in my book. So I'm happy to see that that's also happening. So tell us about NRCan's action plan, and then then we'll drill into forestry if we can.
Sure. NRCan's action plan is based on the principle that start where you are. We're looking at things like nothing about us without us, involving those who are most affected by decisions in the decision-making or in the decision-making around delivery, around what we do and how we do it. It's also the principle of using data and being evidence-based in our decision-making. So we want to do things like build a strong way of looking at how do we measure progress. and use that to identify where we're going to go and also how we're going to measure. The key pieces, I would describe it in three, the pieces that NRCan is attacking. One is increasing our representation so that we're reflective of the society we want to serve. We're doing that in a way, looking at the specific kind of job groupings and the specific groups as well, what we call equity-seeking groups that are underrepresented. And we're using acquisition or talent or HR methods to try and increase the numbers there. We're doing that at the same time as we're mobilizing employee networks, or what we call quite often the industry employee resource groups, and supporting them to foster inclusion, mutual support. They are creating programming, and we're asking them to help us create the kind of environment that retains talent. So we got this whole recruitment, development thing. We're doing mentorship programs, sponsorship programs, really trying to support people to have the kind of mobility they want to have within the department. We're also looking at how do we create that culture of inclusion. Beyond the employee resource groups, there's a lot of education to be done. And it's not just awareness that diversity inclusion is a thing. It goes beyond that. We're doing training around what are the practical aspects, tips, tools, what are the expectations? What are the commitments that leaders need to make? What are the performance management metrics we can use to get people actually creating an environment where people feel psychologically safe, where people feel valued as employees, where they feel free to raise their voice and bring forward their thoughts. So the tangible things, every part of NRCan is doing its own way, but those things at the departmental and in the sector and branch level, those things are happening. So we're using those pieces.
That's great. That's great. It sounds very familiar with what we're doing here in forestry. Yeah. I'm wondering within NRCan, knowing there are different components, there's earth sciences, there's mining, there's energy, there's forestry. Obviously, you're familiar with what we're doing in forestry. And I'm curious, are other parts of the department doing the same approach, or are they each doing their own thing? Like, have they in some way learned from what we're doing because we're doing it sectorally? I'm curious how that has been working within the government, because as I go into talking with provinces, for example, I just did a webinar in BC, and people were really excited with what I was saying in terms of addressing the issues. I had people calling from Alberta who were watching and saying, we need this. We need you here. There's nothing going on. And I guess the deputy minister there was just dismissed with sexual harassment charges. So, there are issues across this country in the government systems that are still needing the kind of approach that you're doing within NRCan. So I'm just kind of curious about what are other parts of NRCan doing? You obviously can't be in charge of what's going on in the provinces, but are they all doing this in lockstep? Are they all taking this kind of approach?
Yeah, they are.
That's good. That's
big
good.
Time. And they're learning from each other. And they're learning from industry, and they're learning from provinces. What my experience is, Kelly, I'm talking to people across the federal system. Everyone is approaching it in a bit different way, but we're all using similar metrics. Hires, people departures, we're looking for a decrease in the amount of claims of discrimination and racism. We're looking for a resolution of those claims. We're also doing learning and practical application of learning and tracking if people are actually using it. We're figuring out if employees are actually feeling included through our public service employee survey and other methods too, like anonymous feedback, skip level meetings. Yeah, it's happening in oil and gas. Yeah, it's happening in mining, in earth sciences. Yes, they're doing it. But one of the things that's really important is it needs to align with the business priorities and objectives. And so there's a degree of autonomy that organizations and individuals need to have to address equity, diversity, and inclusion using their own context and their own data and their own business priorities to guide. The other piece that we're doing is getting programs to evaluate themselves. We're developing an EDI lens toolkit so that people can evaluate themselves and know what the gap is between where they are and where they want to be. And then they can start using tools and tricks and best practices or wise practices from others to get there.
It's getting me all excited. I got all kinds of ideas. So I'm just thinking that within NRCan, what's exciting and interesting to me is that there are these little groups, I shouldn't say little, but mining and forestry and oil and gas, they are different personalities. right? They're different cultures. They interface with different stakeholders that are different personalities. I've worked with them. They're very different. I find forestry that, everyone jokes that foresters are tree huggers. They're nice people. they're very thoughtful, I find. They're very much wanting to be sustainable, right? There's a different mindset. It's not an extractive industry so much. So there's a certain mindset I find that comes with forestry in particular that I find refreshing when it comes to diversity and inclusion. I'm not sure if that's your take on things, but I'd be interested to hear that. And then if you can share with us if there's anything beyond what you just explained in the overarching NRCan approach that is specific to the forest sector that listeners would be interested to know about. Like for example, one of the things I could think off the top of my head, and this may be applying to everyone across the department, but is your procurement policies. I'm sure that's across the whole department. People are now coming to me and saying, Kelly, we now have to get more familiar with D&I. Can you help me? Because we have to adhere to the policies at NRCan if we want to get any funding. And I'm like, yay, this is exactly what we should be doing. They would easily affect change. And I say that this is what industry can do along their supply chain is quite easily address attention to D&I by doing something simple like procurement policies. I'll leave that to you to answer that one.
Well, thanks, Kel. Your take on forestry being good people that have that openness to dialogue and even an openness to having some of the tough conversations that are needed. I think that's a really great asset that the forest sector has, and one that I think we're leveraging and learning from. So yes, concur with you about that culture of openness, that culture of innovation, and working together. And I think that stems from the history of the sector, where collaboration with land users for multiple variables is not optional. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. Got to make it work. And it all comes down to people. And this here is a human being issue. This is not an esoteric, technological, or engineering issue. This is really a human being issue. Now, what I've seen in the forest from the Canadian Forest Service is that there was that early openness amongst many of the natural resource sectors. And I think I saw that in industry. And I also see that in the way that the forest sector, the Canadian Forest Service is operating. Early adopters of things like, can we ask people to do under our grants and contributions program, can we ask people to look at diversity and inclusion and consider it an asset in our grant making program so that we can better understand what their needs are and they can be the ones to characterize it? See, that whole idea of not being prescriptive and telling people how to do it, but saying to them, we want to know because it's an important aspect of meeting the needs, the requirements of Canada and a renewed workforce. But putting it in the hands of those folks and also doing it at a scale where we're not asking, mom and pop operations to provide as much extensive detail and D&I planning as we are of these massive corporations that we've got. Mm-hmm. You mentioned procurement, and I'm just starting to have the conversation at the department-wide level about tools and tips to do that. Tools to provide, perhaps not like how do we work? There's ways to help people get in the door and compete on level basis. So we're not talking about preferential treatment, but we're talking about creating opportunities for Canadian businesses to compete with a more level playing field by, for example, adding points if a firm has a diversity and inclusion plan, if they have or they indicate that they're going to use the funding received to ensure that they address D&I targets, if they're going to create skills opportunities, training and development opportunities, internships for folks coming from communities that have up to now been excluded. Now, it's been so interesting, Kel, because I've also had to say to people, hey, this doesn't mean that we're 100% flipping over. Lots of people have that thinking that, now we're only going to hire people from such and such a group, and I'm going to be excluded. And I do my best to communicate to people that, no, we're adding to the mix.
Yeah, the pie gets bigger.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah, I think that is part of the communications strategy, you could say, is that and we're having to do that too with the sector-wide action plan that we're putting through with Free to Grow. It is about bringing down the defenses of those who have had power and privilege by default in this country, and letting them understand that there's opportunity for everyone here. We're not trying to isolate out those folks that were there prior, but we're really trying to create the best team possible. And so it's just messaging that in a way that's non-confrontational and non-threatening. And addressing, it gets into the conversation about addressing fears, root fears, and concerns. So that process takes time. As I talk about that with the how to overcome resistance in the workplace work. It's like you got to go through a process, and you can't expect it to happen overnight. And realistic expectations for onboarding this new way of thinking. It's an evolved way of being, and that sort of thing. So it takes time, and I think as people can relax into that a bit, there's not the same anxiety of like feeling like Yosemite Sam, you're going to get shot down if you are a white guy. People don't want to hear that, obviously, but there needs to be some space, a safe space for everyone to get into this. One of the things I'm talking about now as we move into phase 2 of Free to Grow is about how to create a safe space for men to share their stories. I mean, we talk about, obviously, we're going to address the inequities of underrepresented groups, but I think one of the keys to engaging those who are currently in those positions is to create a space for them to speak about their issues that they've faced. So, and I'm starting to speak about this in my various posts on social media, because, we've now seen the harassment that came out of the Catholic Church. We've seen it with Boy Scouts. We've seen it with hockey, and they're starting to come out more and more. And to me, this is guys who have been affected in this country and been suppressed with their issues, that have repeated, in some cases, the behaviors that they were subjected to. And part of the we're all in this together conversation, I think, is to create that space for them to get on an equal playing field. Like, you know what I mean? Like there's other parts to this conversation that have yet to emerge that will create that, I'd say, fundamental shift, because they're real issues that are currently swept under the carpet.
Love it. We have a group in one of the employee resource groups that's created what they call a safe space methodology. And they created it in the context of some of the anti-Asian hate and the anti-Muslim, the shooting in London, Ontario recently. And so they've been developing this methodology. It's been used by others and coming together to have what I call hot conversations, honest, open, and transparent, where people get to share their stories and others get to listen. And, I am pioneering at NRCan a safe space, looking at people who are asking the question, what about me? We're using the safe space approach to create exactly what you're talking about, a space where people come together to talk about where they sit on the EDI continuum and what their experiences have been. Looking at it from the perspective of dominant culture, which in this case would be looking at it from that white male perspective, because it's real. Like I'm having conversations all the time with people who are worried about getting left behind, not having opportunities for their kids in the future, and also who have some real fears that need to surface. So we're starting to have those conversations out in the open. I'm hosting an event, I think, is it next week? That's our first one, having folks come together. And let me tell you, it is such a good thing, because one of the things is that we end up myth busting. People think this stuff is black and white. Well, it's well beyond black and white. People think that increasing representation means eliminating certain groups. That is just not the case. I said to somebody, we're going from 80% people of European background to looking at wanting to have 75%. I said, that's a material change, yes, but it's something we need to do to be representative of the people. Well, and they're like, I never thought of it that way, right? And I'm like, you need to think about it. It is the proportionality that is important. And this is not a zero-sum game. So yeah, that's exactly what we're doing. And, I am getting to be the queen of awkward conversations. I'm saying to people, hey, listen, what is your EDI? Where do you fit? How do you situate yourself? And do you love anybody? Do you know anybody? Have you connected with anybody who has a different path than you do? And what did you learn from that? And that's been valuable. But Kel, it's one person at a time coming to the understanding and taking action.
Agreed. Well, I have one more question for you, Trudy. And this is, a bit of a dream visionary question, I guess, because I don't know that there's clarity. But where do you see the federal government on D&I in 3 years? I mean, actually, let me be more specific. Where do you see the forest sector with D&I in 3 years?
Well, I see the forest sector continuing along the trajectory that it is, where I'm seeing higher proportion of balance and representation, whether it's gender or persons with disabilities, people from other backgrounds. I see that renewal of the workforce seeding the kinds of innovation that we need in order to take advantage of the digital transformation and the opportunities we have as we move towards net zero emissions. I see the forest sector building a reputation and branding itself for being a modern workplace with as much allure, can I say, as much allure to new graduates coming from all over the world to join our world-class global firms and organizations in Canada. I see the opportunities for research coming out of various people of all kinds of backgrounds and looking at all kinds of tremendous applications, developing products, services in the forest sector that we can't even imagine. The pace of change is accelerating. And so I see from a diversity and inclusion perspective, that whole innovation transforming the forest sector, maybe not in 3 years. Maybe in 3 years, we've gotten to a higher level of representation, a higher level of injection of innovation that comes through that diversity and that branding around people who know and love the forest sector the way I do, the way you do, as saying, hey, this is the forest sector now. Like, whatever your myths were or your thoughts or your assumptions were about who's working in the forest sector and for what end, it's going to be faces like you and I going, yes, sustainability, equity, environment, and economy. We work on all of those, and we're proud to do it here in Canada. How's that?
Hear, hear. Sounds great. Well, I look forward to seeing all that happen in 3 years. And Trudy, is there anything else you would like to share with our listeners before we close off for today?
Sure. Thanks, Kel. I would like to share one thing. It's a beautiful quote from Supreme Court Justice. When you're used to privilege, equality feels like oppression. I just want to leave that with folks because this change that we're making, it's not comfortable initially for many of us, but we know it's necessary. And it will feel funny. We'll feel uncomfortable to change our ways, but we got to do something different to get a different outcome. And the opportunity's there. And we need to just reflect on that and take action.
Very true. Thanks for that, Trudy.
Thank you.
I want to thank you very much for your time today. I know you're a very busy person and you got a lot going on as you've just shared with us today. So thank you, Trudy. And we will watch with great interest as to what unfolds at NRCan. And of course, we want you to continue to be involved in some fashion with the forest sector in particular. So we'll have to find ways to make that happen.
Right on. And a real thanks to you and to the Canadian Institute of Forestry, because this is amazing to actually do this. So congratulations to the organization and to you, Kelly. It's a real pleasure.
Thanks very much.
Gender, diversity, and inclusion are crucial to the advancement of a thriving and resilient forest sector. As we continue to grow and change, we all have a role to play in making our sector a place where everyone has the support they need to succeed and thrive. For more information on how you can take action and help make a difference, follow Free to Grow in Forestry on social media or visit us at www.freetogrowinforestry.ca. And if you have a story you think should be heard about an experience you have had or what you'd like to see happen in the Canadian forest sector workforce, we'd love to hear from you. Please email us at freetogrowinforestry@cif-ifc.org. Together, we can move forestry forward.